The year was 1871, and Red Hollow baked beneath a merciless sun. Dust rose in slow spirals from the wagon ruts, hanging in the air like ghosts that didn't know where else to go. At the center of town, between the saloon's swinging doors and the general store's porch, stood a crowd, the kind that comes when the scent of scandal rides the wind. And in the middle of them all, a young woman trembled. Her name was Clara Weston, and every eye was fixed on her. A torn sleeve hung from one shoulder. A streak of dirt crossed her cheek where she'd been shoved to the ground. Her hat was missing, and her hand shook so badly she could barely hold her shawl against her chest. Someone shouted, "Thief!" Another voice followed, "Can't trust a drifter woman." Marshall Tate stepped out from his office, the floorboards creaking under his boots. He was a tall man with a belly gone soft and a badge that still gleamed like he'd polished it to distract from the rest of him. He looked over the crowd, then down at Clara. "What's this about?" he asked, his voice slow, gravelly. From behind the store counter came Martha Keene, the storekeeper's wife, sharp as vinegar, her eyes cold as creek water. She held up a gold brooch that sparkled in the sunlight like a curse. "She stole it," Martha said, loud enough for half the town to hear. "Found it in her apron pocket not 10 minutes ago." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Women leaned into each other. Men folded their arms. Clara shook her head. "That's not true. I never—" "Don't lie to me, girl," Martha snapped, stepping closer. "You were the only one behind the counter this morning. That brooch has been missing since. I didn't take it." Clara's voice cracked like glass. I'd never steal." Marshall Tate looked at her for a long moment, then to Martha. "You're sure you found it on her?" Martha nodded, face hard as bone. "Ask anyone here. They saw me pull it from her pocket." The marshal sighed. "Then the evidence stands." Clara's heart pounded so hard she thought she might faint. "Marshal, please. Someone must have." "Enough." He raised a hand, and silence fell heavy. "You're lucky this ain't Dodge City. Out there, they hang thieves." A man in the crowd spat near her boots. "She ought to be whipped." A child laughed. The sound cut deeper than any lash. Clara's knees buckled, but she stayed upright. Pride was all she had left. Her eyes burned as she turned to people she'd worked for, served coffee to, smiled at. None looked back. Not one. Red Hollow had a way of turning on its own faster than a stampede. It wasn't about justice. It was about entertainment. "Get her out of here," Martha hissed, waving her hand like shooing a stray dog. "I won't have a thief working my store." Marshall Tate cleared his throat. "You're fired, Miss Weston. Best you leave town before sundown." A heavy silence followed, then a low whistle. Boots scuffed, and slowly the crowd began to part, leaving a narrow path down the street, an aisle of humiliation. Clara stood there a moment, trembling. The dust stuck to her tears as she whispered, "I didn't do it." But nobody cared. She clutched her torn satchel, the one she'd carried since her father's death 2 years ago, and began walking. Every step echoed like a hammer against her ribs. The wind caught the edge of her dress and flung dust into her face, as if the town itself were spitting her out. From the saloon balcony, a drunk cowboy raised his glass. "A toast to the pretty thief," he shouted. Laughter rolled through the street. Clara kept walking, head down, heartbreaking. Near the end of the crowd, someone stood apart, a man leaning against a wooden post, hat low, coat dusted gray from travel. His boots were worn, his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbows. He wasn't laughing like the rest. He just watched. His name was Eli Carter, though few in town knew it. Some called him the Quiet One. Some just called him Ghost. He'd been working the outlying ranches, mostly keeping to himself. But now his eyes followed Clara like he recognized something in her that others didn't. When she passed, he spoke just loud enough for her to hear. "Keep walking, miss." His voice was calm, low, steady, like water over stone. A rock flew from the crowd. It hit Clara's shoulder hard enough to make her stagger. She turned, eyes wide. The man who threw it grinned. "Thieves don't belong in Red Hollow." Before she could speak, Eli moved. One step forward, slow but deliberate. The crowd's laughter died as he looked at the man who'd thrown the rock. That how you treat a lady? Eli said. No one answered. He didn't raise his voice. Didn't draw a gun. He didn't have to. Something in his stare made the air itself feel heavier. Clara, clutching her shoulder, met his gaze for half a second. There was something in it. Something that didn't belong in Red Hollow. Pity, or maybe mercy. By the time she reached the edge of town, the sun had begun to fall behind the ridge. The heat eased, leaving the air cool and lonely. She crossed the dry creek bed where grass used to grow, her boots scraping stone. She didn't know where she was going, only that she couldn't stay. Her father used to tell her, when the world turns its back, walk anyway. Dust don't stick forever. But tonight, the dust clung like sin. She stopped by a dead oak on the hillside, dropped her satchel, and sank to her knees. Her whole body shook. The humiliation, the fear, the loss, it all came crashing down at once. She pressed her palms to her eyes and wept until there was nothing left but dry sobs and the sound of crickets. When she finally lifted her head, twilight had deepened into night. Stars blinked faintly through the haze. Then she heard them. Hooves. 3 of them. Clara's breath caught. She backed against the tree trunk, heart racing. The riders approached slow, deliberate. She recognized their silhouettes. The same men who'd been laughing loudest in town. One carried a lantern, swinging from his hand like a warning. Well, one called out, looks like the little thief's still hanging around. Marshall told you to leave, didn't he? Said another, voice thick with whiskey. Reckon we should help you along. Clara pressed herself harder against the bark. Please, leave me alone. The one with the lantern dismounted, boots thudding softly in the dirt. Ain't no one around to see. Sweetheart, we just want to talk. His hand reached out, catching the hem of her shawl. And then, crack, a rifle fired. The lantern burst. Flames sputtering in the dirt. Horses reared, snorting in panic. One of the men shouted, "Who the hell?" Another shot rang out, shattering the quiet night. Drop it. A voice barked from the darkness. The men froze. Out from the shadows stepped Eli Carter, rifle leveled, face half lit by the dying fire of the lantern. His eyes glowed pale in the dark, one brown, one gray. You boys lost, he asked. The first man cursed under his breath. Ain't none of your business, Carter. Eli cocked the rifle. The sound echoed through the trees. It is now. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, the men backed away, muttering threats as they mounted up and rode off into the night. The sound of hooves faded until there was nothing left but the whisper of the wind and the crackle of the dying fire. Eli lowered the rifle. You all right? He asked. Clara swallowed hard, still trembling. How did you... Didn't feel right, the way they ran you out, he said simply. Figured you'd end up out here. He slung the rifle over his shoulder and looked toward the horizon. You got somewhere to go? Clara hesitated. No. He nodded once, as if that was all he needed to hear. Then follow me. She blinked. Why? Eli turned toward his horse. Because nobody deserves to be left to the wolves. Not even in Red Hollow. They walked in silence. The sound of their boots, the only thing breaking the dark. The moon rose behind them, pale and cold. Clara followed the broad shadow of the cowboy ahead, her mind spinning. She didn't trust him, not yet, but she trusted him more than the men who had called themselves decent. After a while, she asked softly, Why'd you step in? You don't even know me. Eli's answer came after a long pause. Don't need to. The wind carried the scent of rain. Far off, thunder rolled like the growl of something ancient. The night felt bigger than it had any right to, and somewhere deep inside her, beneath the hurt and shame, a small ember flickered, a sense that maybe, just maybe, she was as alone as she thought. As they disappeared into the open plains, the narrator's voice rose, low and steady, like a song carried by wind over graves. Out here, a name could be ruined faster than a house could burn. But sometimes, just sometimes, a single act of quiet defiance could start to turn the ashes back into light. And that night, as Red Hollow slept, Two souls, one broken, one burdened, walked into the dark, not knowing that by dawn they'd owe each other their lives. The storm rolled in before dawn. By the time the first thunder cracked, Clara and Eli were already half a mile from the edge of Red Hollow, their boots sinking into mud as the night turned black and restless. The wind whipped Clara's hair into her eyes, stinging like tiny lashes. She clung to the back of Eli's horse, her hands gripping the saddle horn, her whole body shivering with exhaustion and disbelief. Eli rode steady, his shoulders broad and unmoving, as if the wind itself bent around him. Lightning flashed, brief, white, merciless. For a heartbeat, she saw the plains stretch wide and empty around them, the horizon swallowing everything. Then darkness fell again, thick as tar. "Hold on," Eli called over his shoulder. She did. When they reached a small rise overlooking a gully, he pulled the horse to a stop. The air smelled of rain and iron. "Cabin's just past those trees," he said. "Ain't much, but it's dry." Clara nodded mutely. Her voice had left her somewhere back on that dusty street. She could still hear the laughter, the sneer of the crowd, the child's giggle, the sound of Martha Keene's voice saying thief like it was gospel. The cabin came into view, a squat, timber-built shelter pressed against a hillside, smoke rising from its chimney in a thin ghostly thread. Eli dismounted, tied the horse to a post, and pushed open the door. The hinges creaked. Inside smelled of pine tobacco and a hint of coffee long gone cold. A single chair, a rough-hewn table, a cot against the wall. It was barely a home, but after what she fled, it felt like a fortress. "Sit," Eli said simply, setting down his rifle. He poured water from a tin jug into a bowl, handed it to her. "For your hands." Clara stared down at them. Blisters, cuts, grime. Reminders of how hard she'd tried to live decent in a town that never wanted her. The water stung, but she didn't flinch. He busied himself with the fire, throwing on a few logs. When it caught, the glow painted the walls gold. Rain hammered the roof, steady and cleansing. He ladled beans into 2 tin bowls. Handed her one. "Eat," he said. She hesitated. "Why'd you help me?" He looked at her then, really looked. Didn't sit right the way they treated you. Folks forget how easy it is to turn cruel when they're all looking the same direction. She tried to smile, but it cracked before it reached her eyes. "You don't even know if I'm guilty." "I know what guilt looks like," he said quietly. "And you don't wear it." Days passed. The rain didn't stop, but neither did the work. Eli fixed the leaking roof. Clara mended torn shirts. When the wind died, they'd ride out for supplies, silent most of the way, each lost in their own ghosts. She learned that Eli wasn't from Red Hollow. He'd come south after the Tremont Range War, where his brother was shot in a fight over cattle rights. "Men called it justice," he said once, staring at the fire, "but all I saw was graves." He didn't talk much after that. Clara wanted to ask more, but something in his silence told her not to. Some pain was too sacred to prod. Instead, she busied herself keeping the cabin in order, sweeping, cooking, patching holes. It gave her hands something to do when her thoughts got too loud. Sometimes, when the fire burned low, she'd catch Eli glancing her way, not in curiosity, but like he was checking to make sure she was real. One night, thunder hit, so close it rattled the door from its hinges. Eli jumped, hand going his revolver, before he realized what it was. His breath came fast, shallow. "You all right?" Clara asked softly. He nodded, though his eyes said otherwise. She stepped closer, placing a hand on his arm. His skin was warm, taut beneath her touch. "You're shaking," she whispered. "Just a habit," he muttered, setting the gun down. Storms sound too much like gunfire sometimes. For a moment, they just stood there, the firelight flickering between them. The distance that had once felt so vast now seemed fragile, paper-thin. Clara whispered, "You saved me that night." He met her gaze. "You'd have done the same." Her lips trembled. "No one ever has." Eli didn't reply. Instead, he pulled a blanket from the cot, draped it over his shoulders, and stepped back toward the fire. The storm outside roared, but inside, The quiet between them deepened into something almost tender. Morning broke gray and cold. Clara stepped outside, breathing in the scent of wet earth. The sky hung low, clouds dragging their bellies across the hills. She felt smaller than ever, and yet, for the first time in weeks, safe. Eli joined her, coffee steaming in a tin cup. "Posse will be coming soon," he said. Her stomach tightened. "For me? For both of us." Marshall Tate don't like folks making him look weak. "What will you do?" she asked. "Same as before," he said, sipping slow. "Stand my ground." The calm in his voice frightened her more than the threat itself. By noon, the sound of hooves thundered through the valley. Marshall Tate rode in with 2 deputies, rain dripping from the brims of their hats. Clara froze as they dismounted. Tate's hand rested on his holster. "Carter," he said, voice low, "you know harboring a wanted thief's a hand offense." Eli leaned against the porch post, arms crossed. "She ain't wanted for anything, except being innocent." Tate sneered. "You calling me a liar?" "No," Eli said, "just mistaken." The marshal's eyes flicked toward Clara. "You come with us now, Miss Weston. Maybe we forget this little stunt." Clara's heart pounded. She looked at Eli. "If I go, they'll—" He shook his head. "You ain't going anywhere." Tate's jaw clenched. "You think you can stand against the law?" Eli's reply came like gravel. "I've seen worse men wear badges." A long silence. Then Tate spat in the mud, turned his horse, and muttered, "You'll regret this, Carter." The posse rode off, but the promise in his voice lingered like smoke. When the dust settled, Clara whispered, "You shouldn't have done that. They'll come back." Eli looked toward the hills. "Let 'em." That night, the wind changed. The rain stopped, and the air turned dry. Strange. The sky glowed orange in the west, though there was no sun left to set. Eli stood outside, scanning the horizon. Then he smelled it. Smoke. He ran for the door. "Clara, get what you can now." She rushed to the table, grabbing the satchel and a blanket, confusion giving way to terror. Through the window, the glow brightened. "Eli, what is it?" Before she could finish, the wall exploded with fire. Someone had set the cabin ablaze. Eli grabbed her hand, yanked her toward the back. "Go! Go!" Flames licked the rafters, crackling, roaring. The air turned thick, unbreathable. Clara coughed, eyes streaming. She stumbled, tripped over a broken chair, and Eli pulled her up again, his arms strong around her shoulders. They burst through the rear door as the roof caved in behind them. The heat was unbearable, searing against their backs. They ran into the open field, collapsing onto the wet ground as the fire devoured everything. The cabin, their brief refuge, was gone. For a long moment, neither spoke. Just the sound of their ragged breathing and the rain that began to fall again, slow and cold, like mercy from the sky. Clara's voice came small, trembling. "They did this, didn't they?" Eli nodded, eyes fixed on flames. Marshall or his men. Could have been either. He stood, jaw tight. "We can't stay here." "Where will we go?" He looked toward the ridge, where lightning lit the sky. "There's a cave by the river. We'll wait out the night." They walked through the rain, soaked to the bone, following the faint sound of rushing water. The storm's edge flashed above them, silver veins across the sky. Clara's legs ached. Her feet slipped in the mud, but Eli kept her steady. By the time they reached the cave, the night had grown silent again, save for the steady drip of rainwater from the rocks above. Eli started a small fire, the flames barely a whisper. Their shadows danced against the walls. Clara sat close to the warmth, clutching the blanket he'd thrown around her. "You said back there that I wasn't guilty," she murmured. "How do you know?" Eli didn't look up from the fire. "Because I know who was." Her head lifted. "Who?" He exhaled, long and tired. "Martha Keene." Clara's breath caught. "The storekeeper's wife?" Eli nodded. "Saw her at the saloon the night before you got blamed. She was talking to a gambler, trying to pawn that same brooch. Guess her husband didn't know she had debts." Clara's hands went cold. "Then why didn't you tell the marshal?" He finally met her gaze. You think Tate would have listened to me? He's been on the Keene's payroll since before I came here. That's why I stayed quiet. But when they turned on you, I couldn't keep quiet anymore. The fire popped, sending a spray of sparks up the wall. The cave glowed orange for a heartbeat before falling back into shadow. Clara stared into the flames, her voice a whisper. They ruined my name to hide hers. Eli's voice softened. Then we'll take it back. She looked up. How? By showing the truth. He leaned forward, his face lit by the firelight. There's a man at the saloon who knows her debts. Bart the dealer. If we can get him to talk, we can prove she stole it. Clara hesitated. And then, Eli said, his tone firm, we ride back into Red Hollow. The rain eased, and silence fell heavy around them. Outside, the plain stretched endless and dark. Clara pulled the blanket tighter, watching the fire die slow. For the first time since her world had burned, she felt something new settle in her chest. Not peace, not yet, but purpose. She glanced at Eli, who was staring out toward the night, rifle resting across his lap. You really think we can win? She asked softly. He didn't look back. Ain't about winning. It's about standing where you got knocked down. She smiled faintly through her exhaustion. You talk like a preacher. He shook his head. Preachers quit too easy. A quiet laugh escaped her lips, small but real. The sound surprised them both. Outside, the last drops of rain fell from the heavens, hissing into the embers of their fire. Somewhere beyond the dark hills, the first hints of dawn waited, ready to break. Dawn broke soft and pale over the plains, washing the horizon in tender shades of gold and rose. For the first time in weeks, Mary wasn't thinking about running. The storm had passed. The barn stood tall again, smoke curling from its chimney. The horses fed, and the quiet cowboy who rebuilt her life stood outside, sharpening his knife against a whetstone. The world seemed almost gentle, but she knew peace never lasted long out here. Jake hadn't spoken much since the night of the fire. He worked through the pain in silence, his burned arm bound tight, his jaw set, eyes shadowed by the kind of hurt no man could name. Mary wanted to thank him, to tell him what it meant that he'd stayed when every other soul in town had turned their back. But words, like the ones that truly matter, had a way of sticking in her throat. So she baked bread, biscuits, even a pie, using what little sugar she'd salvaged. When Jake walked in, the scent of apple and cinnamon filled the cabin. He paused in the doorway, hat in hand. You didn't have to do all this. I know, she said, setting the pie on the table. But I wanted to. For a long while, the only sound was the ticking of the clock and the soft clink of his fork against the tin plate. Then he looked up, his gaze steady. You think they'll ever forgive you? Mary froze. The question wasn't cruel. It was honest. The kind of honesty that hurt because it was true. No, she said finally, voice low. They won't. Not them. But maybe I can forgive myself. Jake nodded once, slow and understanding. That's worth more than their forgiveness. Later that week, word came that Sheriff Miller had been killed, shot on the trail outside Dry Creek. No robbery, no struggle, just a bullet through back, and his horse found wandering by the river. The town whispered. Some said bandits. Others said revenge. But when Mary heard, she felt the chill crawl straight through her bones. She knew who it was before Jake said a word. Eli Crow, Jake muttered, staring into the distance. I knew he'd come back for blood. The name alone was enough to drain the color from Mary's face. Crow, the outlaw who'd once courted her sister, the same man who'd been driven out by Miller's men last spring. He'd sworn vengeance then, and vengeance had come. Mary, Jake said, stepping closer, if he knows you're alive, if he thinks you've still got ties to the sheriff. I don't, she interrupted, too fast. I have nothing to do with that man. Crow doesn't care, Jake replied. He'll come looking anyway. That night, the wind rose again. Not the wild, roaring wind of the firestorm, but something leaner, sharper. A warning carried on the air. Mary couldn't sleep. She stood by the window, staring out at the dark stretch of land beyond the barn. The moon was high. The prairie whispered like something alive. Jake was outside, making rounds with his rifle slung low. Every few minutes, she saw the faint glow of his lantern moving between the shadows. He didn't look back once. There was something about the way he carried himself, like he'd already made peace with danger, like he'd long ago accepted that the frontier didn't spare the good-hearted, only the determined. When the first shot cracked through the night, it split the world in two. Mary ducked instinctively, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Jake!" she cried. The door burst open. "Down!" he barked, dragging her behind the table. A second shot splintered the window. Glass rained across the floor. "They're here," he said between breaths. "3 of them, maybe 4. Crow." Jake's jaw tightened. "Yeah, and he brought friends." He reloaded, calm as the eye of a storm, then looked at her, really looked at her. "Stay here, no matter what happens." "Jake!" But he was already moving. The gunfire lit the fields like flashes of lightning. Muzzle flares burst behind the corral, men shouting curses into the wind. Jake fired back from behind the water trough, a single man against a pack of killers. Mary pressed herself against the wall, praying, trembling, hating the way fear made her useless. Then she saw the lamp, still burning by the stove, and a memory struck her, the night of the barn fire. How helpless she'd been then. How she'd sworn never again. Not tonight. She grabbed the rifle Jake kept by the door. The wood felt heavy, foreign, but right. She stepped into the yard. The cold hit her first, then the smell, gunpowder, and wet dirt. "Jake!" she shouted. "Mary, get back inside." But before she could answer, a shadow lunged from the fence line. A man, face twisted with rage, eyes wild under the brim of his hat. She fired, once then again. The recoil slammed into her shoulder. The outlaw dropped like a sack of grain. Jake turned, shock flashing across his face. But he didn't waste time. Together they held the line, 2 souls backed against the burning edge of the world. When the last shot faded, the silence that followed was deafening. They buried the man by the cottonwoods before dawn. Jake said a few quiet words. Mary couldn't speak. Her hand still trembled from the weight of the rifle, from the realization that she'd taken a life. Jake laid a hand on her shoulder. "You did what you had to do." She nodded, eyes glistening. "I know, but I never wanted to." "No one ever does," he said softly. As the sun climbed, painting the land in pink and gold again, she turned to him. Will it ever end? The running, the fighting, the shame? Jake looked out toward the horizon. "Maybe not, but we can choose what kind of people we are while it's happening." Then for the first time he smiled, small and quiet. "And you, Mary, you're stronger than you think." Weeks passed. The town eventually learned what had happened. The attack, the deaths, the sheriff's killer put down by a woman they'd once called a disgrace. Some still whispered. Others crossed the street when she passed. But a few nodded in respect. When the new preacher came, he asked her to bake for the Sunday gathering. And for the first time in a long while, she said yes. She wore her old blue dress, the one she'd hidden after the trial, the one that had once made her feel human. As she stood at the back of the churchyard, handing out slices of pie, she caught sight of Jake leaning against the fence, watching quietly, hat low, a faint smile ghosting his lips. Their eyes met. He tipped his hat, and in that single gesture, she understood everything words could never say. Forgiveness wasn't something granted. It was something built, brick by brick, day by day. That evening, when the lights softened and the fields turned to gold again, Jake saddled his horse. "You leaving?" she asked, trying to hide the ache in her chest. He nodded. "Got a job up north. Cattle drive. But I'll be back." Mary swallowed hard. "You don't owe me anything." He smiled faintly. "You're wrong. You gave me something I thought I'd lost." "What's that?" "Reason to stay still." He climbed into the saddle. The wind caught his hat brim, sunlight glinting off the silver buckle on his belt. He looked like something carved from the land itself, strong, quiet, unyielding. Mary stepped forward, brushing the dust from her skirt. "Jake!" He turned. "Thank you," she said simply. He nodded once, then rode toward the horizon. Months later, when the first snow came and the ranch was alive with the sound of cattle and laughter again, Mary stood on the porch with a cup of coffee in her hands. The sky was a soft gray, and the world felt clean, like it had been forgiven. A rider appeared in the distance, cutting through the mist. Her heart knew before her eyes did. Jake. He rode up slow, dismounted, and smiled that same quiet smile. "Miss Harper," he said, "heard you've been keeping busy." "I had to," she teased. "Someone's got to keep this place standing." He chuckled. "Looks like you've done more than that." She studied him for a moment. "You staying long?" "Long enough," he said. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was peaceful, the kind that says everything without a word. She looked out over the land, the same land that had broken her, burned her, and finally healed her. Then she turned back to him. "Come on in," she said. "You look like you could use a warm meal." He smiled. "And maybe a piece of that pie?" She laughed. "Maybe." As they walked toward the cabin, the last light of day settled over them, soft and forgiving, and the narrator's voice rose one final time.